Welcome everyone. As I'm sure you know, the tin market's in a very interesting place just now, and we're looking forward in this particular session in exploring some of the viewpoints on that and some of the key questions that come out of that situation. This particular presentation is focused on looking at the demand side of the equation and in particular looking at what's driving tin demand both now and in the future, and hopefully shedding some insight into some of those questions. A lot of focus at the moment, for example, on how much of the present tin demand is related to fundamentals and how much is related to the pandemic and to technology and so on. So hopefully we can shed some insights into that, and I hope you'll find it useful. Our general approach in this presentation is to first look at what drives tin use in general. So we're going to deconstruct the tin use and demand profile briefly by sector, just to show the various ups and downs that are observable in each of the sectors, to see how it all breaks apart. Then we're going to look at exactly where we are at the moment in terms of the best insights we've got into that rather turbulent period that we're in now as we're coming out of the pandemic. And then finally we're going to put all that together, look at the drivers, both existing drivers that are here now and some exciting new drivers that we see ahead, and see where we're headed in the next 5 years. So that's basically how we're going to approach this briefly. Start by looking at the general tin demand profile. This is a summary of tin demand by sector, and hopefully this is familiar to most of you, based on our data from 2020 estimates. Half of tin use is used in solder, mainly for electronics, some for industrial. The next largest sector and growing is chemicals, used both in polymers and in a wide variety of inorganic fields like electroplating. Tin plate, a more traditional market sector, comes third. Lead acid batteries is still providing a steady growth there in fourth position, and then copper alloys and other metallurgical uses up behind. So that's the demand profile, and it doesn't change at the moment that much year by year. The takeaway really from this slide is that tin is critical to the quality of modern life. So tin is a ubiquitous element. We call it the spice element because it's sort of everywhere, but you don't realize it. How would we do, for example, living in a world without electronics, which is all linked together with tin, or cars, or any of the other things we see here? So that's good news for tin. It's a commodity that is, though little known, embedded firmly into our modern lifestyles. So let's look then at the long-term growth rate of tin over, let's say, the last 40 years, as you can see here. And actually it's a remarkably stable picture, despite the fact that over that period some of the drivers have changed quite significantly in their profile. The tin use growth rate has been fairly consistent, fairly constant, at not far from 2%. What you can see in the middle of this graph in the 2000s is a significant surge in tin use there, and that was really due to two reasons. One is a technology reason. During that period we had the conversion of solders from leaded solders, 60% tin, to lead-free solders, 97.5% tin largely. So that was a significant boost. And secondly, the Chinese economy grew sharply in that period towards double figures in terms of manufacturing growth rates. Then we see this crash that came in the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, very significantly. And over the last decade, both of those factors that I've mentioned have mitigated. So on the solder side, actually miniaturization has decreased solder use as solder joints have shrunk. And secondly, the Chinese economy itself has decreased from its double figures towards the 5 or 6% in manufacturing, at least, that we see today. So the profile over the last decade has been steady, but rather similar to its steady growth rate over the last decade. So breaking down now some of those, unbundling some of those factors from one another by sector, we see here the main trends in the solder market over the last decade. As we've already said, electronics is about 80% of the use of tin in solders, segmented into the typical categories there. The 3 C's: computers, communications, consumer, followed by automotive, industry, medical, military, and so on. So looking at that already, you can see if tin is right in the center of some of those markets, you can see why it's a very good place for tin to be just now. Also, there's some use in copper pipe plumbing, electrical wiring, and so on. And I'm going to show you some new use in solar ribbon. Generally, as far as the profile of this market's the case, electronics markets have been growing at fairly constantly at 4 or 5% over the last while. Auto market at the moment is especially strong growth. It's about 7%. I think we all know that cars are becoming computers on wheels. China is the major user, as you can see in the graph on the bottom left. The pink line is China. Most electronics are made in China, and large appliances like kitchen dishwashers and washing machines, TVs, and so on. They can correlate the growth rates of that production in China with solder use in China quite well. So that's the profile. What we're seeing in the actual tin use, which is in blue there, is quite turbulent over the last decade and quite hard to read. What we're seeing really is that macroeconomics has had a very significant impact on some of those turbulations, and otherwise technology is the other strong impact, as I mentioned, both the effect of miniaturization, which has essentially flattened solder use from that 4 to 5% growth, and I mentioned already lead-free. And at the end of that, at the end of the decade, as we're coming out of that decade, we're also expecting some very significant new market opportunities for solder, as we shall see. We drop down to the second use of tin. Generally, chemicals, as we already said briefly, we see 2 product families here. Organotin chemicals used in polymers, in organics, in a wide variety of other uses. These markets again are steady in growth. Polymer markets in construction, PVC, polyurethane, silicon rubber, all used in houses, especially in emerging economies growing steadily at about 3%. There have been some regulatory pressures ubiquitous in this market for tin, especially organotins, although in fact there are potential for lead replacement in India and China. It's a very diverse sector, especially in the inorganic sense, and so it has quite a bit of robustness in it. And generally speaking, this market, as you can see in the profile there, although it has been growing strongly over the last decade, in 2018 there's a break point there, which corresponds to the start of the US-China trade war, followed by the COVID pandemic. And this market, the tin chemicals market, has been most strongly dependent on macroeconomics and affected by both of those things, because it's strongly export dependent, and its production of tin chemicals does rely strongly on a lot of imported intermediates. So tin chemicals, if we look forward at tin plate, is more traditional market. It's a very flat market actually. The total amount of tin plate produced in the world over the last decade has been remarkably constant. But though what we see here on the graph on the left, the bottom left there, is tin use itself has steadily decreased for 2 reasons. One is coating weight reduction, where the amount of tin has been steadily decreased per can, and secondly, economization in production, less sludges, less waste, and so on. Generally, this market is mature, I would say. Food cans the largest sector. There is competition. There are opportunities for this market. It's very recyclable. Obviously, there's pressure on plastics, and there's a good market for pushing forward on food waste, for example. But tin plate hasn't really seemed to be able to capture that. However, as we should say shortly, there has been quite a good boost to canned food use, at least in the pandemic. So that's the profile for tin plate. And lastly, looking at alloys, what we see here is just putting together tin used in lead acid battery grids, which is about 1% additive, with bronzes and brasses and other coatings. Quite a whole bunch of different metallurgical uses here. As we can see on the graph again on the bottom left, steady growth over the last decade, mostly provided by lead acid batteries, which the largest use is in China for e-bikes, outside China for start-stop hybrid vehicles where the high tin batteries are needed. What we see there is that their steady growth will peak in the next decade with competition from lithium-ion and many others, but at the moment is still providing that growth for tin. Some of the other markets until now have been quite traditional, quite stable, but now we are starting to see some very interesting new possibilities in tin copper, lightweight bronze wire, for example, for auto. A lot of infrastructure we expect to put in place for EV and climate change will use copper, bronze, switching, bus bars, that kind of thing. So we're looking carefully at that. And I think there's definitely opportunities there. So that's a brief summary and deconstruction, as I've said, of the different drivers that are present in the market and where they've been up the last decade. So briefly, where are we now in terms of looking at all of that, putting it together? And one summary, one issue here is that it's not just that those growth rates have resumed. There's been some essential changes to that during the pandemic. So the pandemic has generally been a win for tin in some important cases. So notably, working from home has boosted home office equipment. Everyone's using Zoom, virtual meetings, that kind of thing. Obviously had to buy more computing equipment. There's been more communications, more servers, more infrastructure backing that up. Because people have been at home, they've been buying new kitchenware. People wanted more gaming consoles, that kind of thing, furniture, and all those things. And that has boosted tin markets considerably, especially electronics. And at the same time, there's been this exodus from cities as people have realised they don't really want to work from home in a city. They want a nice place to work, so they're moving out. And especially in the US, where you can see the picture in the bottom left there, they have a lot of PVC used in the cladding of American houses. That's been another example of a boost to tin use, tin chemicals in that case. Other pandemic effects have been included, as I already mentioned, stockpiling canned food. We've also seen all our car batteries running flat, and so needing new lead acid batteries, and there's been some boost to some plastics uses as well. So there's a number of catalogue of boosted uses. I think the question here really is, okay, how much of that is permanent? How much of that is temporary? How much may there be perhaps a permanent shift in baseline, particularly around working from home? I think these are sort of largely open questions at the moment. Look in the graph at the top left there, you'll see computing production in China plotted across the last year or so. In pink, you see the average line, 3-year average in black dotted line last year. Then you see that clearly illustrated the boost to computers as we went into working from home, last year about 10% above average, and coming into this year, then on the bottom top left there, actually that sector has been boosted yet further in Q1 in terms of computing. So that one at least is not only persisting but increasing in Q1, and so we're looking to some of these others to see how long they will maintain. At the moment, we're hearing that many of them are still maintaining, but we wait to see. So looking over the whole profile in terms of the demand surge that we're seeing, if you look at the bottom left there, at the sort of macro data we have for the last 2 years, looking at this case at global manufacturing PMI weighted for tin, we can see clearly the effect of the US-China trade war over the period of 2019 brought the whole of manufacturing to a virtual halt. And then you see in early 2020 the significant impact of COVID, and now as we're coming out of that in the end of 2020 and into Q1, we're seeing some very significant recovery of PMI at least. In fact, in the US and Europe, record US and Europe PMIs, manufacturing PMIs for there. Chinese production is a bit more subdued, but steady. And that's reflected in the refined tin consumption. If you look on the top left there, where we see global monthly tin consumption coming down, firstly in September and December 2019, through then into COVID with a minimum about September 2020, and then climbing out of the pandemic. And what's happening, as we all know very much, that this surge coming out of the pandemic into not just in tin but in all commodities is got this mismatch with supply, this issue with logistics, and so we've got rising prices, a lot of concern over inflation. In the case of tin, what we're seeing is that there's a whole bunch of raw materials that are associated with tin markets that are becoming critical, notably chips. So semiconductor chips, obviously at the heart of all electronics, closing auto plants, and generally quite a lot of anxiety about that, with maybe the recovery next year would be good sort of messages. Alongside that, we have now, especially in Europe, a polymer shortage, unprecedented shortage of polymers in Europe. Steel prices going through the roof. Odd situations where tin plate is even cheaper than steel core, for example. At the same time, we've got construction materials tightening fast, which is obviously going to affect tin chemicals markets in particular, and now also copper foil shortages impacting circuit boards. So right across the board, these other raw materials are going to squeeze demand growth in tin, and so that's the general summary of what we expect. That demand is still strong at the moment, but in H2, inevitably, I think the higher prices, especially in China, and these shortages will constrain the growth in the second half of the year. And at the same time, we've got some other negative effects, some continuing COVID waves in Asia, particularly in Taiwan. Everyone's watching the chip factories in Taiwan at the moment, for example. And some of the other effects too will mitigate. So whereas consumers have been spending money on home appliances, will now spend money on holidays and other things. So there are some factors which we suspect will mitigate demand in H2, but as with all things, let's wait and see. So lastly, I just want to focus on four new drivers that we see coming, which we are looking at now and seeing how it's going to affect tin demand in the next 5 years at least. So the four factors we're going to just briefly highlight here. Number one is solder technology drivers. And we've already mentioned miniaturization a lot, and here we're highlighting that, in fact, that transition to what's called SMT technology, the shrinking of solder joints, technologically is completing, and we're seeing that, for example, in China with the changing product mix. So solder paste is increasing there, which is telling us that they're using a lot more SMT there, and so on. So we're tracking that, and if you look on the bottom left, there you can see over the last decade or more, in fact, the growth in semiconductor shipments in red, which I already mentioned, is about 5% typically for the electronics market. But in blue there you see the solder tin electronics solder line is flat, is stable because of miniaturization, and that's then indexed by dividing one by the other. You end up with the tin intensity of use line, the grey line at the bottom. And so with that, we can see on an index basis there over the last decade, essentially, so that the amount of tin used per circuit board today is about half of what it was, let's say in 2008. But also what you can see there is clearly, hopefully, is that effect is fading as we're coming into the new decade. And what we would expect then is, as that effect fades, tin use in solder will start to resume that 4 to 5% and get closer to that growth rate in electronics. It's worth mentioning at the same time, the lead-free conversion I mentioned earlier has resumed. It's been stable over the last decade, about 65%. We're now starting to see that rise a little bit, and there are some drivers for that. And if we forecast completion of that by, let's say, 30 to 90%, then it's about 7,000 tons of tin, something like that. So not insignificant. So there is market drive, technology drivers for the solder market, which we do expect over the next decade will add to tin use in solder. The second new driver that I'm going to highlight is the fourth industrial revolution. This is something everyone's getting very excited about. It's a new era, supposedly, of interconnected automation, built on these 5G communication networks, which we're seeing being built now. It's described as the fusion of data, machines, and biology. So it's kind of a scary idea where artificial intelligence replaces humans, if you like. That's built up of a whole set of new technologies. So smart technologies, Internet of Things, those kind of things we're already seeing in our smart home devices, for example, factories to machine, talking to each other, not needing humans anymore. Vehicles don't need humans to drive them. Drones, wearables, all these kind of things. So this is the new era, and this is all essentially new electronics markets and devices, all glued together by tin. And so even if we just look at the first part of that, the 5G infrastructure build, we can make some estimates for how much that's going to be, and then on top of that, all these expanded communications, computing, and industry uses, and so on. So this is an area which is very much in the focus as we're looking ahead in the next decade for tin use. Secondly, and very powerfully at the moment, we've got the green industrial revolution, the reaction to climate change. Here is a bunch of technologies associated with largely with energy, in which tin is playing a part. So we've got energy generation on the one hand, solar, wind, heat. We've got energy storage, how we're going to store that new electrical energy in batteries or perhaps fuel cells, those kind of things. How we're going to deal with carbon dioxide, we're going to capture it, or maybe we can reuse it to make carbon dioxide, and that's another area. How we're going to clean up the planet with waste recycling, cleaning up pollution, that kind of thing. So we track the R&D at ITA. We look through thousands of scientific abstracts every month, and we're seeing all this happening in real time, at least in R&D. Tin is already catching the solar wave, as I'm just about to mention. We've been talking for a long time about tin and lithium-ion batteries, and we're just starting to hear the first echoes of that in commercial evaluations and that kind of thing. So we're following that very, very closely. There's a lot of R&D on tin in the energy materials. Still most of it in R&D, but it gives us the idea that tin will be used in this. Carbon capture catalyst is particularly prominent in that R&D, where tin copper particularly is very good at converting carbon dioxide to formate, which is a precursor to other chemicals. We're also seeing tin used in many different examples in the water treatment, and we're looking at some new recycling technologies and so on. What I would say is that a lot of these technologies on their own will not have significant tin use, but as a basket, we are very clear that I think that tin will benefit from this, but in probably the longer term, so 2025, 2030 timescale is where we'll start to see some of this impact. Lastly, the fourth new driver is something that's fairly new to us at ITA, which is solar ribbon. So this is the product in the bottom left, which is a copper ribbon, which is coated with 20% roughly solder by weight. It's a tin lead solder. Previously, we understood this was mainly from secondary sources, but now we're hearing it's starting to use refined tin. And some of the estimates for that, about 75 tons per gigawatt, something like that. What the market forecasts on this strongly depend on the scenarios that are being used for solar and the amount of gigawatts that will, particularly the annual installations that will be put in place. The dark blue line in our graph on the top left there is the data we're getting from the forecast we're getting from our China office, where 80% of solar ribbon is made. Other forecasts from the International Energy Authority are more conservative. Here you see different scenarios. The light blue line at the top is their net zero forecast, which I guess most of us realize is probably unachievable. The opposite end there is the black line on the bottom, which is just meeting the minimum Paris Agreement requirements, and we see in fact that is a fairly flat line for tin. If there's a more policy-driven agenda and people fulfill their promises, we'll see the red line and so on. So we're looking at this, realizing it's very scenario dependent and taking a relatively conservative approach, but building this into our forecast, because as we progress out from that, we should start to see some really quite significant impact positively on tin markets. So lastly, if we then put that all together, look at what we've got, look at those new drivers, what does it tell us about where we are and where we're going? Generally speaking, as we've already said, if you look on the graph on the left, we've seen this increase in tin demand being foreshortened starting in 2018 by firstly the trade war, secondly the pandemic, although not quite so bad as we expected in the pandemic. We're now seeing demand coming out of the pandemic, and we've yet to see exactly how that works out in 2021, but it's certainly in recovery. It will, at least we expect, resume the 1.72% growth that it has been from there, wherever it ends up, mainly driven by China. But given what we've already highlighted, the four strong technology-based drivers, we would expect that growth to over the next decade increase from the standard 2% towards 3 or even 4% growth, which is what's projected there in the model. What we can see there in our model is that we've included all of the technology factors that we've mentioned, the miniaturization, 5G, EV, and so on. We've combined that together and come up with some scenarios, so that, for example, the grey line there is a sort of moderate technology scenario where some of this is delayed a lot or somewhat, and then the red line, technology super cycle, or roughly what that would look like. But whatever scenario we look at, we can see that we can probably expect significantly increased tin demand over the next decade if we assume that the market and the world remains pretty well as it is. And I think probably most of us realise that's a bit of a risky assumption at the moment, and with all the economic and geopolitical risks that we're looking at, it would not be unreasonable to expect that we could get another event, another factor which dips tin demand again over the next 5 years. But if we be positive, we can see this kind of profile. The other thing to mention is that this is only forecasting to 2025. Obviously, if we push all that out to 2030, we get some really kind of huge numbers, as everyone's discovering when we look at technology and technology metals. At the moment, we're only confident to go as far as 2025, and it's a kind of wait and see before we really project that out much further. So I hope that you found that interesting, and I hope it's helped to highlight some of the drivers that we're talking about, what's been driving tin, where we are now in terms of the drivers, and where we hope to go in the future. Thank you for your attention.